Thanks so much for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, the Communication Workers Union has warned that there's a huge possibility that the South African Post Office may cease functioning at the end of this month. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed a new bill that the government hopes will reboot the ailing South African Post Office. Last year, it was placed under business rescue, owing creditors 8.7 billion rand. And to talk to us about the South African Post Office and what it's currently going through and perhaps where the solutions may lie, we're joined virtually by independent analyst and academic Khaya Sithole, as well as CWU National Bargaining Coordinator Nathan Bowers. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live to both of you. Now, Khaya, if I could start with you. Looking at President Cyril Ramaphosa signing into law the South African Post Office Amendment Bill, is this a step in the right direction in terms of where the Post Office finds itself, having received several bailouts from government to stay afloat, so to speak? Are we moving in the right direction?
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers. I think it is more of a stillborn and really late step. And when you look at the crux of what that amendment bill sought to do, is that it sought to try and vault the post office into a modern age. And this is something that the post office should have done many years ago. And I think if you go back to the classic iteration of what postal services were meant to be, postal services fulfill what we refer to as a universal service obligation, which was obviously to connect as many human beings for as cheaply as possible. So when you look at the type of footprint that a post office would have, it was in fulfillment of that particular mandate. The problem with the South African Post Office is that its mandate never really kept up with the times. So what you then saw over many years is that the way people communicate and the way people exchange information kept evolving at a much faster pace than the ability of the post office to keep up. So when you then look at what this amendment bill tried to do, it was essentially trying to bring the post office into the 1990s, allowing it to essentially be part of a much wider and a much more modern communications ecosystem. Now, unfortunately, that happened far too late, and it really is a type of action that, while good in intention, is unlikely to get the type of outcomes that the government had in mind when they first thought about this particular step. And unfortunately, it is indeed a type of a stillborn exercise.
Now, Khaya, the South African Post Office was placed under business rescue. 2023 it was. It owes around 8.7 billion rand. So just looking at that situation, where do you think the Post Office went wrong, and what do you think are the major impediments right now to actually turning this entity around, if that is at all possible?
I think where the post office went wrong is that it rested on its laurels for a very long time, in the sense that obviously as a state-backed entity with a particular obligation, it really only stuck to that particular mandate. And when it became clear that the way in which human beings were interacting with the post office was essentially moving along and shifting along, the post office didn't keep up. And the consequence of that is that you and I have probably not been to a post office unless it's for a really extraordinary set of circumstances where only the post office can deliver those services. What the post office also then saw is that it started being bypassed by new and different ways in which people were receiving and exchanging information. And it also didn't help that operationally it had particular challenges relating to service efficiencies and the way in which the public perceived it. So those are all the sum of problems that you then saw. And ultimately, when you have problems of that nature and people start looking at different ways in which they can get the same service, you do have a revenue crunch, and that revenue crunch will be fine if we're getting the type of subsidies that are necessary to keep you afloat. But in the South African context, we know what diminished appetite for state bailouts has been over many recent years. And when you get those bailouts, you at least are given some breathing space in order to change and adapt. And because the post office essentially needed parliamentarians to give it that breathing space through this amendment bill, it really sat paralyzed and watched by as circumstances happened around it. And those are just some of the factors that led to this situation, which ultimately led to business rescue, which I suspect is going to be the way things are going to be for a bit of an extended period of time.
Now, Nathan, the Communication Workers Union has warned that there is a huge possibility that the South African Post Office may cease functioning as soon as the end of this month. So Firstly, what makes you say that? What are you basing that claim on? And also, what efforts are currently being made to help the South African Post Office financially?
Look, let us first understand that the South African Post Office was placed under provisional liquidation, and at that point already it was in deep trouble. And then at the liquidation hearings, the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies told the court in papers that the government is prepared to put in 3.8 billion rand into the post office if the post office is placed under business rescue. So when the business rescue practitioners came into the post office, they already inherited a debt of, it was around 11 odd billion rand. Now, subsequent to that, they went into a vigorous cost-cutting exercise where they slashed thousands and thousands of jobs to the detriment of the workers and their families, of course. And then after that, we went into the Section 189, and we were defeated in the Section 189, especially around the operational model, and especially around cutting the offices and cutting the staff drastically, because we had an understanding that the cabinet way back in 2024, three already, sanctioned that this monies will come. The 2.4 billion will come through Treasury, and the 3.8 billion would then also come from the fiscus. So to be able to sustain the business plan. Now, of course, the business plan already speaks to what the Post Office Amendment Bill is saying. All of us are saying that you must modernize the post office. It has been there in documents. We ourselves, as a Communication Workers Union, have put forward numerous proposals to have this one done, to modernize the post office, to make the state empower the state, to ensure that the post office gets work even from the state. And so we said, as the CW, to government, you have promised this 3.8 billion. Now that in October last year already we were at day zero, meaning that salaries and wages would stop being paid. Now, as we are talking now, and this is the gist of it all, as we are talking now, we have been in numerous engagements with the BRP, especially around operations, not only what I'm going to say now, on operations also. We told them, how can you close offices that are profitable? How are you able to stop certain walks of postmen? How do you bring in private people to do the transport? Why don't you employ people that have been retrenched into transport? So we have raised this with them. But in the recent meetings, we have asked them, where is this 3.8 billion rand that you said in your business plan will finance the business rescue process? So it is at this point that we are now, that the business rescue practitioners, as a few days ago, told us that money is not forthcoming, the operations is being placed in jeopardy, the salaries and wages of workers are being placed in jeopardy. And in the meantime, while there's dithering here and dithering there, the South African Post Office workers and their families are in a state of panic. And we as the union are saying to the government, you must meet with us. We are inviting them to this meeting publicly. We want to understand from them why they are undermining a court situation where it has been agreed in court. Otherwise, the post office would have been liquidated. Now, where do we stand now? If the post office operations cannot be sustained, then of course the salaries won't be paid, the modernization cannot take place. But let us say this on TV. We are saying that if the government is able to bring that money, the post office is able to pay the 18 cents in a rand to the rest of the creditors. We will then be able to have clean books in the South African Post Office. The private partnerships, private-public partnerships that the Communication Portfolio Committee Chairperson is talking about would be more than welcome. And we could then also see whether we can empower the state. Why must we give private companies work of local government, provincial government, and national government? Why should we do it? Why shouldn't the state empower the state? So
well, Mr. Bowers,
is a question of political will.
A question of political will, but isn't it also a question of the inability of the post office to deliver? You speak to the general public. You go to the post office on any given Monday, and you go for a service, and inevitably you are turned away because there's no ink, there's no this, there's no that. As far as the modernization of the facilities go, again, I don't know, the post offices where you are, but the ones around where I am, there's nothing modern about them. And therefore, that is not your first port of call. You don't go to the post office unless you absolutely have to, because more often than not, you are turned away. A simple thing like the renewal of a car license disc, you now have retailers taking over that space, which the post office was playing in. So, again, and maybe Khaya, you can come in here. How does the post office turn it around? Because they're not only having financial and other difficulty, but they've lost face with the public.
Yeah, an easy turnaround, because you imagine that for a lot of people, it hasn't simply been a matter of, well, now that the post office cannot deliver, I no longer receive those services. People have found alternative ways of receiving those particular services. What is of particular interest is that if you look at the type of footprint that the post office has, again, in line with its universal service obligation, it is a type of footprint that is then matched by the local government structures. In other words, it is pervasively available across the country. So if you find a way of pairing what some of those public services are and what the post office's business model needs to be, then you stand a chance of getting it done. So I think driver's licenses are one particular example where obviously everybody needs to be able to access a particular service point. So turning the post office into a point of service for a variety of government services is precisely what the amendment bill needs to be. But unfortunately, again, when you start the process 10 or 20 years too late, the cost of funding it is extremely onerous. National Treasury is not in the habit of doling out money into state enterprises, particularly when they've taken the view, as many people have, that this is not a strategic enterprise. So this is not an ESCOM, this is not a Transnet. If there is no bailout, everybody assumes that we'll find a way around it. And that's the unfortunate reality of where we find ourselves. So I think if there was a wholesale government focus on ensuring that this becomes a point of sale or the point of delivery for a variety of government-related services, then you could build a particular blueprint for a new postal service of the times that we live in. But until you get to that particular point in time, it's difficult to imagine that any additional allocation from the fiscus is going to get us very far, given just how big the challenges have become for the post office in recent years.
So, quick question, Khaya. Is the South African Post Office still a viable business entity?
No, it isn't. So the reason it's in business rescue, the reason there was immediate liquidation is because it was not a viable business entity. That doesn't mean that it cannot be turned around and turned into such. And it's a simpler question of, is the government interested in doing such a thing? And we have to distinguish between political rhetoric, which is the type of nonsense that politicians say in order just to get the headlines going, versus their actual intention. So it is irrelevant what you and I think. It's a question of when we look at the budget next week that gets tabled, is there any intention firstly to rescue it? And if there is such an intention, how do we then see what the roadmap that is being funded is? In the absence of that, it's all just empty speak.
In about a minute or so, what should be done to ensure that the South African Post Office doesn't cease functioning at the end of this month, as you've warned?
Yes. Sakina, can I go?
Yes, please.
Look, Sakina, firstly, we must say we mustn't lose sight of the legacy issues within the South African Post Office over many administrations as one. But as to we are certainly asking government to come to the party, and it's not a bailout, to do as they told the courts to do, to issue the 3.8 billion rand negotiated if they must, to ensure that the business rescue plan is implemented in its entirety. As to, of course, when that has been done, we are into to support the private and public partnerships that the government is presenting. And then we are also saying to government, the plan is there. It speaks to the Post Office Amendment Act, which I also agree was a little too late. However, the plan of the PRPs are there. In the meantime, we are being very courteous towards the government at this point. Workers are starting to rumble in the workplaces, demanding that the government makes good to the promises. We have just emerged from a scathing Section 189 within the South African Post Office, and our understanding is that if parties do not continue to talk to each other to find the solution, because we can talk about the Post Office of tomorrow, we can talk about the Post Office Amendment Act, but if we cannot talk to each other and come to the solution to resolve what we see as day zero emerging upon us, and also the communities are the ones who are also suffering, as we know, the gogos who depend on the South African Post Office, who depends on the parcels. These are the ordinary South Africans that the Communication Workers Union are also fighting for, and we want to change the discourse in the country to say that the workers must all suffer. But in this case, there is a plan on the table. We have put our positions at the CW. We want to talk to government. We want to talk to all the stakeholders to come to the rescue of the South African Post Office as an entity with the biggest footprint in the country.
All right, that's where we have to leave it, unfortunately. But thanks so much for those insights, independent analyst and academic Khaya Sithole, and the Communication Workers Union National Bargaining Coordinator Nathan Bowers, speaking about the state of affairs at the South African Post Office. Not great, but that's what it is.